They told me someone had been sneaking into my house while I was away on business trips, and at first, I didn't believe it. The words hung in the air like a warning I couldn't ignore. My name is Jack Miller, and I had always thought of our home as a sanctuary, the place where Emily and I shared quiet dinners, Saturday morning coffee, and lazy Sunday afternoons. But that night, the stillness of the house felt different, almost electric, as if it were aware of secrets I hadn't uncovered yet. I walked through the front door, feeling the weight of the warning press down on me, noticing the faint scent of air freshener, the way the carpet fibers seemed to press differently under my shoes. Every picture frame on the wall seemed to glare back, as if judging my obliviousness. I told myself to stay calm, to not let fear dictate my actions, but my mind couldn't shake the thought of someone moving through our rooms, unseen, untouchable, while I was hundreds of miles away. I checked the locks one by one, tracing the cool metal with my fingertips, and I imagined the living room furniture slightly out of place, the cushions disturbed in a way Emily would never do herself. I poured myself a glass of water and let the tension settle into the quiet corners, listening for the slightest hint of a sound that didn't belong. As I stood there, I reflected on the past weeks, Emily's extra time at the office, the small absences she didn't account for, the hushed phone calls she answered behind closed doors. Each detail seemed innocent alone, but together they began to sketch a pattern, a shadow that moved just beyond my perception. I walked to the kitchen and picked up a coaster I hadn't noticed before, a faint smudge marring its otherwise pristine surface, and my chest tightened as I realized how easy it would be for someone to slip through unnoticed. I called my neighbor, asking for clarification, and he recounted the details once more, his voice serious, steady, confirming my suspicions without dramatics, simply stating the facts of his observation, the time frames, the small clues he'd pieced together. I thanked him, hung up, and the silence returned, heavier than before, each tick of the clock echoing in my ears. I sat at the dining table, my hands clasped, eyes fixed on the chandelier above, and I made a decision to pay closer attention, to observe, to capture what might otherwise be invisible, knowing that vigilance was the only path to clarity. I began to plan subtle checks, noting when Emily would leave the house, when the mail was delivered, how the lights shifted in different rooms at varying times. Everything became data, every detail a potential clue. By the end of the night, I was exhausted but focused, aware that the days ahead would require patience, precision, and careful observation. And as I finally turned off the lights and climbed into bed, the house seemed to hold its breath with me, waiting, as if it knew the moment of revelation was coming, and that my understanding of our sanctuary, our life together, would never be the same again. The next morning, the sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors of our home, and I moved quietly through the living room, taking note of the smallest details, the cushions perfectly aligned, the coffee mug left slightly askew from the night before, each subtle clue sharpening my focus. Emily was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast, the aroma of toasted bread and brewing coffee filling the air, and I observed her from the hallway, noting the calm in her movements, the ordinary rhythm that masked everything beneath. I walked to the study, checking the locks again, my fingers tracing the edges of the door, feeling the familiar grooves and the cool metal beneath my skin, and I paused at the window, noticing how the light hit the blinds, creating patterns that shifted slowly with the sun. It was almost meditative, the act of observation, yet my mind raced with possibilities, thinking of who might have come through the house while I was gone and what they could have taken or moved, and I reminded myself to remain calm, to gather facts, to record and not react impulsively. I spent the morning noting patterns, the timing of mail delivery, the neighbors' comings and goings, the subtle noises that were often dismissed, and I began to form a mental map of the spaces that could be entered unnoticed. Every footstep, every creak, every shift in light became a potential clue, and I documented everything mentally, preparing for the moment when I would have the full picture. Emily continued her day as usual, oblivious to my heightened awareness, and I allowed the silence to stretch, punctuated only by the sounds of our home, each one amplified in my consciousness. I reviewed past events, small inconsistencies that now seemed significant, and I reflected on my own actions, the times I had been away, the brief trips for work, the evenings spent at meetings, realizing how these absences could have created opportunities for someone to move through our home unseen. I considered every possible explanation, from the mundane to the concerning, and I resolved to approach the situation with clarity, to uncover the truth without suspicion clouding judgment. By midday, I had planned subtle tests, small adjustments to routines, moving objects slightly to observe reactions, noting the changes in light and shadow across the rooms, and tracking the timing of every action. The day unfolded like a controlled experiment, each observation feeding into a growing understanding, each moment a piece of the puzzle. I was patient, deliberate, attuned to every detail, and with each passing hour, the awareness sharpened, the strategy forming in my mind, knowing that eventually, the truth would reveal itself in a way that required precision, calm, and careful attention. And as the afternoon light deepened, I felt a quiet anticipation, the sense that all the small efforts, the subtle vigilance, would converge, providing clarity and control over a situation that had begun as a whisper of concern but was growing into a revelation that could not be ignored. As the evening approached, the light in the house shifted, casting long shadows across the living room, and I remained attentive to every movement, every sound, my senses sharpened by the morning and midday observations. Emily moved through the rooms, her routine seemingly unchanged, yet I could not ignore the small hesitations in her steps, the subtle glances toward the front door, and the way she adjusted objects on shelves that I had not moved, as if anticipating my scrutiny. I reviewed the notes I had taken throughout the day, the sequence of actions, the timing of her phone calls, and the brief interruptions in the flow of the house, assembling a mental map of patterns and possibilities. I placed small markers on the counters, subtle enough that they would not draw attention, and watched how they interacted with the environment, recording every shift in their position. Each detail added depth to my understanding, confirming that my vigilance was justified, and yet leaving room for caution, because assumptions could mislead. The sun dipped lower, the light dimming into warm amber, and I moved to the study to review the camera footage I had set up the day before, pausing on frames that revealed minor movements, shadows that hinted at presence, and reflections in the windows that offered glimpses of activity. The patience required was almost meditative, the act of observing without interference, and it allowed me to see not only the external details but the subtle cues in Emily's behavior, the way she paused, the rhythm of her breath, and the small adjustments she made unconsciously. As the house quieted for dinner, I prepared the table, aligning the silverware with precision, noticing how Emily's attention followed my movements, how she interacted with the space and the light, unaware that I had been monitoring every detail. I reflected on the history of our home, the shared moments of comfort, the routines we had built together, and the contrast between memory and the present tension, allowing me to feel the weight of observation and the responsibility to act only when the pattern revealed itself clearly. The evening continued with ordinary conversation, the kind that concealed layers of observation beneath polite exchanges, and I maintained a steady presence, speaking with calm measured tones, listening closely, and noting reactions that were ever so slightly off. By the end of the night, I had mapped the environment, catalogued behavior, and set the stage for the next day, when the culmination of vigilance would bring clarity, allowing me to confront the situation with certainty, to understand the truth that had been unfolding quietly beneath the surface, and to maintain control over the household without assumption, guided only by careful observation and patience. Knowing that the answers were already present in the subtle movements and patterns I had documented meticulously throughout the day. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across the kitchen floor, and I moved with a quiet attentiveness, my eyes scanning each corner, my mind replaying every subtle detail from the previous day. Emily was preparing breakfast, the routine familiar yet tinged with an unfamiliar tension that made every movement she made seem amplified in my awareness. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth anchor my thoughts, observing the way she adjusted the table setting, the careful alignment of plates and silverware, as if unaware of the scrutiny she was under. I moved through the house methodically, checking doors, cabinets, and the small windows at the back, noting the way light shifted and shadows fell differently at various angles, and I considered how each element could reveal information I might have missed. Throughout the morning, I reviewed mental notes, cataloging the timing of phone calls, the subtle pauses in conversation, and the minute shifts in her expressions that hinted at thoughts unspoken. Every footstep, every rustle of fabric, every faint sound of the refrigerator humming became a part of the puzzle, each element requiring patient attention. I walked through the living room again, noting the placement of furniture, the way cushions had settled since the previous night, and the subtle angles that caught reflections in mirrors, all contributing to an understanding of the house as a space where movements and patterns could be detected if one paid close attention. Emily continued her tasks, humming softly, arranging dishes and organizing the pantry with a normalcy that both reassured and heightened my observation, as the familiarity of her actions masked the complexity of the environment I was studying. I moved to the study and checked the small cameras I had positioned discreetly, reviewing the recordings to ensure nothing was overlooked, pausing on moments that hinted at unexpected activity, minor shadows crossing hallways, slight movements in peripheral areas that could easily be dismissed but which carried significance under careful inspection. As the morning transitioned to afternoon, I continued to refine my observations, noting how the patterns of light and sound changed throughout the day, creating a living map of the household that accounted for every routine and anomaly. The patience required was exacting, the attention to detail constant, yet the process itself became a form of understanding, a way to see beyond the surface and perceive the subtle signals of presence and behavior. By the end of the afternoon, I had compiled a comprehensive mental map, recording observations, movements, and patterns with precise clarity, preparing myself for the next steps with confidence, knowing that the foundation laid by this careful observation would allow me to interpret and respond to any irregularities with accuracy and control, ensuring that the household could be understood fully before any actions were taken. By late afternoon, the sunlight softened through the windows, filling the rooms with a warm glow that seemed almost ordinary, yet I could not ignore the heightened awareness that had settled over me. Emily moved through the kitchen, humming softly, arranging the dishes with meticulous care, each movement deliberate, as if following a choreography I had not noticed before. I observed from the living room, my coffee cooling slowly in my hand, and I considered the patterns I had catalogued over the previous days, the subtle inconsistencies in routine, the small changes that suggested an unseen presence or an action hidden from immediate view. I moved silently through the hallway, pausing at doorways to note the angles of light and shadow, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, each sound amplified in my consciousness, each detail contributing to a mental map of the household that accounted for everything I could observe. As I crossed the living room again, I noted the placement of the cushions, the way the sunlight reflected off the polished surfaces of furniture, and the small discrepancies that hinted at movement when I was not present, each one reinforcing the importance of careful observation and measured patience. Emily's presence was calm, almost oblivious, yet I could sense the subtle tension in her movements, the way she glanced briefly toward the front door before resuming her tasks, and it made me aware of the difference between routine and reaction, between habit and anticipation. I reviewed the camera placements I had installed, considering how the angles captured the flow of movement in the home, the points where shadows shifted and reflected surfaces revealed unexpected details. Each observation was integrated into a growing understanding of the environment, a map that allowed me to predict and interpret the actions around me with precision. As evening approached, I prepared dinner with methodical care, setting plates and utensils in their precise locations, noting Emily's response, the way her eyes followed my actions, how she interacted with the space, unaware that I had been quietly studying each movement for patterns. The light deepened, warm tones shifting to cooler shadows, and I continued to observe, mentally cataloging every motion, every glance, and every sound, weaving them together into a cohesive understanding of the household dynamics. By the time night settled in, I had a clear sense of the rhythms and behaviors, the subtle signals of attention and awareness, and I felt a quiet anticipation that the careful observation of these days would soon culminate in clarity, allowing me to interpret actions accurately, respond effectively, and maintain control over the situation, guided solely by what I had witnessed and documented without assumption or distraction. Confident that patience and attention to detail had provided a foundation for understanding the truth within the familiar walls of my home. By the time twilight settled over the neighborhood, the house seemed to take on a quiet, almost anticipatory stillness. Emily moved through the rooms with her usual efficiency, the familiar sounds of her movements filling the spaces while I remained in the background, attentive to the patterns I had catalogued over the past several days. I observed the subtle gestures, the brief pauses, and the minor shifts in posture that, while seemingly ordinary, suggested a layer of awareness I had not previously noticed. I checked the locks again, tracing the cool metal with my fingers, confirming each latch and hinge while keeping my eyes on the reflections in the glass doors and mirrors, noting how the fading light altered shadows and revealed new angles. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the quiet ticking of the wall clock, and the distant sounds of evening settling outside created a rhythm that I used to measure the subtle movements within the house. I made careful mental notes of Emily's routine, the timing of her phone interactions, and the changes in her expressions when she was alone versus when I entered a room. Each observation strengthened my understanding of the household dynamics and reinforced the importance of patience and precision. I moved to the study and reviewed the camera placements once again, observing the spaces they covered and considering the lines of sight, making slight adjustments to ensure full coverage without attracting attention. Every detail was integrated into a larger mental framework, allowing me to predict movements and identify inconsistencies with accuracy. Emily continued her evening tasks, her calm demeanor providing a contrast to the focused intensity of my observations, and I noted how the interplay of light and shadow created visual cues that further informed my understanding of the home. As I prepared for the evening, arranging objects and monitoring subtle environmental shifts, I reflected on how each small action, from the placement of a cushion to the angle of a picture frame, contributed to a comprehensive picture of the household and its routines. The process was meticulous, requiring both attention to minute detail and an overarching awareness of patterns and behavior. By late evening, I had a precise understanding of the flow of activity within the home, a clear mental map of spaces, movement, and timing, and a strategic plan for observing without interruption. Every action, every observation, and every shift in Emily's behavior had been catalogued, creating a foundation of insight and awareness that allowed me to anticipate developments with clarity. I felt a quiet confidence, knowing that the careful accumulation of details would culminate in a clear understanding of the household dynamics, providing the certainty and control necessary to interpret and respond to any irregularity thoughtfully and deliberately, ensuring that the unfolding events could be approached with both patience and precision. The following morning, the sunlight streamed through the blinds, painting long stripes across the hardwood floors, and I moved with quiet precision through the house, noting the alignment of objects, the subtle shifts in light, and the way shadows played across familiar surfaces. Emily was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast, her routine unchanged but carrying an undercurrent of tension that drew my attention to every gesture, every pause, and every glance toward the door. I sipped my coffee slowly, observing the way she handled the dishes, the careful placement of utensils, and the small movements that seemed almost rehearsed, as if anticipating my focus without overt acknowledgement. My mind traced the patterns of the previous days, reviewing times of absence, moments of quiet, and the minor disruptions that had initially seemed insignificant but now formed a web of context for understanding the environment. I walked through the living room, checking the placement of cushions, the angle of picture frames, the way sunlight reflected off polished surfaces, and the gentle rise and fall of the room's ambience, noting how each element interacted with another to create a living map of the home. I moved to the study, reviewing camera placements and considering the lines of sight, ensuring that nothing could escape observation, integrating each detail into a mental framework that allowed for accurate interpretation of activity and behavior. Emily's movements were consistent yet carried subtle hints of awareness, the way she adjusted objects slightly when moving between rooms, the brief hesitation before opening cabinets, and the minute changes in expression when she noticed me observing from across the room. I catalogued each nuance, mentally layering observations with timing, light shifts, and environmental cues, forming a comprehensive understanding of the home's patterns that allowed me to predict behavior with confidence. The quiet of the late morning was punctuated only by soft sounds, the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, and Emily's gentle footsteps across the floor, creating a rhythm that guided my awareness and sharpened my perception of potential anomalies. I reviewed past interactions and reflected on habitual movements, combining them with current observations to establish a baseline of normalcy, which made deviations easier to detect. As the afternoon approached, I arranged objects subtly to test reactions, monitored the changing light across the rooms, and noted shifts in Emily's attention and focus, integrating every new data point into the mental map I had built over days. By early evening, I had a clear understanding of the flow of activity within the home, the intricate interplay of light, sound, and movement, and the subtle cues that indicated awareness or intent. I felt a measured anticipation, confident that these careful observations and the patterns I had catalogued would provide the clarity needed to understand the situation fully, ensuring that any future actions could be guided by precision, insight, and deliberate patience, maintaining control while observing without assumption, and allowing the truth to emerge naturally from the careful accumulation of evidence. The evening shadows stretched across the floors, and I moved through the house with careful awareness, observing the subtle interactions between light and objects, the small reflections in the windows, and the way Emily's movements carried an almost imperceptible rhythm that suggested both familiarity and intention. I paused by the dining room, noticing the precise alignment of chairs and the way the sunlight angled through the blinds, casting patterns across the table that shifted with each passing moment, highlighting even the smallest deviations from normal. My mind catalogued these details while keeping track of Emily's behaviors, the timing of her gestures, and the subtle adjustments she made as she prepared for dinner, all while maintaining an outward calm, allowing her to move freely without suspicion. I moved toward the living room, tracing the flow of space with my eyes, noting how each item, from the throw pillows to the placement of books on the shelves, contributed to an understanding of the environment and its dynamics, and I considered how each change or shift could indicate activity that might otherwise be overlooked. The quiet hum of appliances, the soft ticking of the wall clock, and the faint sounds of movement outside all became part of the rhythm I used to measure the household, blending them into a framework that allowed me to anticipate and interpret actions with precision. I revisited the study and observed the camera angles, making mental notes of the coverage, the perspectives they provided, and the areas still vulnerable to unnoticed activity, integrating this information into a comprehensive mental map of the home. Emily's presence remained calm, her focus on routine tasks, yet each gesture, each glance, each small adjustment carried potential significance, and I catalogued them carefully, noting when she paused, how she shifted objects slightly, and the way her attention moved through the rooms, layering these observations with the environmental cues of light, sound, and shadow. As the afternoon deepened into early evening, I tested subtle changes, moving objects just slightly to observe reactions, paying close attention to the consistency of movement and timing, and noting deviations that could indicate awareness or presence beyond the ordinary. The interplay of these elements created a web of information that, when observed in sequence, revealed patterns, anticipations, and hidden behaviors that I had begun to understand with increasing clarity. By nightfall, I had consolidated these insights into a coherent understanding of the space, the rhythms, and the subtle cues that informed behavior within it, feeling a measured anticipation that the careful observation of each moment, each movement, and each light and shadow interaction would provide the clarity needed to comprehend the full picture. The awareness allowed me to maintain control, to interpret developments accurately, and to respond with insight and patience, understanding that the culmination of these observations would reveal the truth in a manner dictated by the evidence I had meticulously collected, ensuring precision, confidence, and a clear understanding of the household dynamics. As night fell, the house settled into a quiet rhythm, each room holding the subtle echoes of daily life, and I moved through it with a careful awareness, observing the angles of light, the placement of objects, and the faint patterns of movement that had become familiar over days of patient attention. Emily was in the living room, arranging books on a shelf, her motions deliberate and precise, and I noted the micro-adjustments she made, the brief pauses when her gaze flicked toward a door or window, as if sensing changes in the environment without realizing I was observing. I reviewed in my mind the sequence of actions I had recorded, each nuance catalogued and layered with environmental cues, creating a mental map that allowed me to anticipate movements and interpret behavior with increasing clarity. The soft hum of the heating system, the occasional creak of floorboards, and the gentle shift of sunlight fading into the warm glow of the evening all became part of the framework through which I analyzed the household, each sound and shadow integrated into a comprehensive understanding. I moved from room to room, quietly testing subtle variations, shifting small objects, and noting Emily's reactions, the way her hands lingered on a counter or brushed lightly against the surface, each gesture observed with careful precision. The patterns of light and shadow, the cadence of her movements, and the minute changes in posture all provided insights that I layered with knowledge of prior observations, constructing a detailed picture of the household and its routines. As I prepared a small evening snack, aligning plates and utensils with deliberate care, I noted the way Emily interacted with the space, the subtle expressions on her face, and the way she adjusted her steps to navigate the room, integrating these cues into the growing understanding of the dynamics at play. I paused to reflect on the history of the home, the shared routines and small gestures that had defined our life together, and how the accumulation of careful observations now allowed me to interpret the present with clarity and confidence. By late evening, I had a detailed map of the environment, cataloging every minor movement, sound, and shift in attention, providing insight into patterns and deviations that might otherwise be unnoticed. The awareness that emerged from these observations gave me a sense of control, patience, and preparedness, ensuring that when the moment arrived to interpret or respond to irregularities, it would be guided by careful attention, precision, and the clarity of understanding built over days of deliberate observation. The household, quiet and familiar, now held a transparency that allowed me to perceive actions, anticipate behavior, and understand subtle signals, providing the foundation for informed decisions and measured responses that respected both the space and those within it, culminating in a comprehensive awareness of the environment and the interactions that defined it. The following morning, the house was filled with a soft, golden light that slanted across the floors and walls, and I moved through each room with deliberate care, noting the position of objects, the subtle play of light, and the quiet cadence of everyday sounds that had become meaningful in ways I had never considered. Emily moved about the kitchen with routine precision, her actions calm and methodical, and I observed the small, almost imperceptible cues in her movements, the slight hesitation in her steps, the way she adjusted her hands on surfaces, as if sensing shifts in the environment that were invisible to the unobservant. I traced the flow of space from the living room to the study, noting how the angles of light altered shadows, the way reflections in mirrors provided glimpses of activity, and how minor disturbances in the placement of items could indicate movements that were otherwise hidden. My mind catalogued these details meticulously, integrating each observation into a larger understanding of household patterns and routines, reinforcing the mental map I had been developing over days of careful attention. I checked the locks on doors and windows once more, ensuring the integrity of each entry point while observing the interaction of light and objects across the rooms, understanding how the natural changes in illumination could reveal subtle discrepancies in the environment. The faint ticking of the wall clock, the hum of the heating system, and the distant sounds from outside all became part of a rhythm that informed my awareness, allowing me to interpret and anticipate movements with accuracy. Emily continued her tasks, seemingly unaware of the scrutiny, and I noted the interplay between habitual actions and minor deviations, each one contributing to a clearer picture of spatial and behavioral dynamics. I revisited the cameras in the study, reviewing angles and coverage, integrating the visual information with the observations of the previous days, layering insights about light, motion, and attention into a comprehensive framework. As the day progressed, I made subtle, controlled adjustments to objects and observed reactions, noting how small changes elicited awareness or responses that reinforced patterns I had catalogued. By afternoon, I had synthesized the observations into a precise understanding of the household, the timing of movements, and the nuanced signals of awareness and routine. The cumulative attention to detail provided a sense of control, allowing me to interpret the environment, anticipate actions, and maintain situational clarity. Each shift in shadow, each minor gesture, and each sound now contributed to a coherent understanding that would guide my actions with informed confidence. The house, familiar yet under new scrutiny, held all the cues necessary to reveal the truth gradually and clearly, ensuring that my perception, patience, and careful observation would culminate in an accurate and complete understanding of the household dynamics without assumption, distraction, or oversight. The evening light softened as shadows stretched across the rooms, and I moved through the house with deliberate care, observing the familiar spaces in new ways, noting the subtleties of light shifting over surfaces, the gentle hum of appliances, and the quiet cadence of everyday life that now carried hidden significance. Emily was arranging items on the shelves in the living room, her actions precise, almost rhythmic, and I watched as each small adjustment revealed patterns, tiny deviations from ordinary routine that suggested awareness and intention. I traced the path of her movements from the kitchen to the hallway, noticing the faint creases in the carpet where footsteps had pressed, the way objects had shifted slightly since my last observation, and the subtle differences in the reflection of light off the polished surfaces of furniture. Every minor detail contributed to the growing mental map I had constructed, a framework of understanding that allowed me to anticipate actions and interpret behaviors with accuracy. I reviewed the camera angles in the study, considering what each lens captured, the spaces that were visible and those slightly hidden, integrating these observations with the patterns I had noted throughout the day. The soft ticking of the wall clock, the occasional hum of the heating system, and distant sounds from outside all provided context, reinforcing the rhythm of the home and the subtle cues that guided my perception. As Emily moved through her routine, I catalogued each gesture, each brief pause, the subtle shifts in her focus, layering these observations onto the mental map that had developed over days of careful attention. I made small adjustments, subtly shifting objects to observe reactions, noting how minor changes elicited responses that confirmed or refined my understanding of the environment. The interplay of light, shadow, and motion became a living map of behavior, revealing the patterns that defined the household and the subtle signals that indicated awareness and intention. As twilight deepened, I reflected on the accumulation of observations, the meticulous attention to the minutiae of daily life, and the clarity that arose from patience and careful scrutiny. By the end of the evening, I had synthesized a comprehensive understanding of the household, the timing of movements, and the nuanced interactions that unfolded naturally within the home. The quiet confidence that emerged from this process allowed me to perceive and anticipate developments with precision, maintaining situational awareness and control without assumption or interference. The familiar spaces now held transparency, each movement, shadow, and sound contributing to a coherent understanding that would guide informed and deliberate responses, ensuring that the household could be navigated with insight and clarity, and that every action, observed and interpreted carefully, would lead to a complete comprehension of the dynamics at play. The night had settled fully over the house, the last rays of sunlight fading and leaving a gentle darkness that made each room feel more intimate and alive with subtle movements. I moved through the living room quietly, observing the familiar furnishings, the way the couch cushions pressed into the fabric, the polished surfaces reflecting dim light, and the patterns of shadows shifting across the walls as the house adjusted to the evening. Emily was in the kitchen, quietly placing dishes on the counter, her motions calm and methodical, yet my trained attention caught the slightest hesitations, the almost imperceptible glances toward the door and windows, and the nuanced adjustments she made to objects as if responding unconsciously to the environment. I walked slowly through the hallways, noting the angles of light from the lamps, the faint sound of her steps against the hardwood, and the occasional click of a cabinet door, cataloging each sound, movement, and reflection into a growing mental map of the household. I reviewed in my mind the observations of previous days, layering the new cues with the old, tracing patterns, and noting any discrepancies, all while maintaining a calm presence so as not to disturb the natural flow of activity. Each object, from a book on a shelf to a decorative vase on the mantel, became a reference point, and I noted how small shifts indicated awareness, anticipation, or subtle changes in routine. I moved to the study to check the placement of the cameras I had installed. Visualizing the angles and lines of sight, confirming that no area had gone unnoticed and that all interactions within the home were captured either directly or reflected through light and shadow. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, and the distant muffled noises from outside created a rhythm that I used to time movements and anticipate actions with increasing clarity. Emily continued her tasks, unaware of the degree to which each subtle gesture and minor adjustment had been observed, and I layered these observations onto the accumulated map of behavior, attention, and routine that had developed over days of careful focus. The interplay of light, shadow, motion, and subtle cues now created a complete understanding of the space, revealing patterns of attention and minor deviations that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. By late evening, the precision of observation allowed me to anticipate activity, interpret behavior accurately, and maintain a sense of control and awareness, confident that all movements and cues within the household were accounted for and understood. The accumulation of careful observation, patient attention, and methodical review provided clarity, insight, and preparedness, ensuring that each aspect of the household dynamic was comprehensively understood and that any future actions could be approached with informed judgment, deliberate care, and full situational awareness. By the end of the night, the house held a quiet clarity, each room illuminated by the soft glow of the lamps, casting long, gentle shadows that revealed the subtle contours of space and movement I had spent days observing. Emily moved about with her usual rhythm, seemingly unaware of the degree to which I had catalogued every nuance of her actions, every small shift in position, every brief glance toward the door or window, all contributing to a complete understanding of the household dynamics. I walked through the living room, noting the precise alignment of furniture, the slight depressions in the carpet, and the way reflections in mirrors and polished surfaces offered additional perspectives on the activity within the home. Each sound, the hum of appliances, the ticking of the clock, the distant rustle of wind outside, was integrated into a mental map that allowed me to interpret behavior accurately, anticipate movements, and understand patterns with remarkable clarity. I reviewed in my mind the accumulated observations of the past days, layering environmental cues, subtle gestures, and temporal patterns into a coherent framework that accounted for routine and minor deviations alike. Emily's movements, calm yet purposeful, revealed the rhythm of normalcy while simultaneously offering insight into her awareness of space and environment, allowing me to discern the difference between automatic action and conscious attention. I moved to the study to confirm camera angles and coverage, integrating the visual feed with direct observations to ensure no detail was overlooked, and mentally noted any remaining blind spots or areas where minor activity might occur unnoticed. The interplay of light, shadow, motion, and sound created a living diagram of the home, each element contributing to the overall understanding of spatial and behavioral dynamics. As the night deepened, I reflected on the process, the careful accumulation of details, and the insight that came from patient observation, realizing that the clarity and control I had achieved allowed me to perceive the environment fully, without assumptions or interruption. By the late evening, I had achieved a comprehensive awareness, a precise understanding of the timing, sequence, and subtle cues of activity within the home. Every gesture, every minor adjustment, every shift in light and shadow was accounted for, providing a foundation for confidence and measured response. The accumulation of careful, deliberate observation had transformed ordinary spaces into a transparent environment, revealing patterns and dynamics that were otherwise hidden, and allowing me to anticipate and interpret actions with accuracy. With this understanding, I could move forward with certainty, knowing that the meticulous attention to detail, patience, and methodical approach had provided the insight necessary to navigate the household with clarity, precision, and control, fully aware of the subtleties of interaction, environment, and routine, ensuring that the truth of each movement and behavior was understood and could be responded to thoughtfully and effectively.